Jean-Paul has also authored Of Comics and Men, A Cultural History of American Comics in 2010, an analysis of the production, content, and techniques of comic books and graphic novels, and is considered that book one of the gold standards on the topic. He has also published a biography of a famous underground cartoonist, simply titled R. Crumb, and about 10 years ago, and a bilingual critical edition of Von Bode's Das Kampf. In 2020, he guest edited the annual issue of the Journal of Comics and Culture about the U.S. comic and bande dessinée in America. He has recently co-edited Freaks, Free Press, and Share. I think I said that right. Freaks, Free Press, and Warthog. Thanks for that translation. A collection of essays about the U.S. underground cartoonist Gilbert Shelton. Forthcoming in January from the Presse Universitaire de Bordeaux. He is the originator of Media BD, MEDIABD, the Angoulême Comic Center database of French-language periodicals of comic art news and criticism, and the director of Bande Dessinée Edition, Théorie and Critique, a master's program in comic studies launched at the University of Bordeaux-Montaigne in 2020. And that's just scratching the surface. So welcome, thank you for being here. Let me just go down the line here and introduce our panelists. Viola Berliou, excuse me. Vi, as I know her, is a PhD candidate in the history department here at CU. She specializes in gender representation and censorship in 20th century comics, with a particular focus on female-led superhero comics in the 1954 Comics Code Authority. Rick Stevens, associate professor in media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, right here. He's the author of Captain America, Masculinity and Violence, The Evolution of a National Icon. He came out 6 or 7 years ago. Dr. Stevens' research delves into, among many interests, the intersection of ideological formation and media message dissemination, comprising studies such as how cultural messages are formed and passed through popular culture, including comic books and comic book-based media. Welcome, Rick. Steven Seagal and his partners at Man of Action created the characters and team featured in Big Hero 6, Disney Marvel's Academy Award winning feature. In comics, he is best known for his semi-autobiographical graphic novel, It's a Bird and House of Secrets, both from DC Comics Vertigo. Genius from, am I 1 to 2?
First Second.
They
just spelled it that.
Which USA Today named one of the best graphic novels of 2013, and The Red Diary, the Red Diary flipbook, the Eisner-nominated noir thriller, Kafka, now in development for television. Imperial also, and the kid-friendly books Batula and Frankenstein, all from the Man of Action imprint and Image Comics. Thank you for joining us. Catherine Labio is Associate Professor of English at CU Boulder. Her articles on comics have appeared in Critical Inquiry, Yale French Studies, and Cinema Journal. She has served as review editor of European Comic Art, curated the exhibit From Bande Dessinée to Artist Book, Testing the Limits of Franco-Belgian Comics, and is completing a monograph on comics and architecture. Welcome, too. And last but not least, of course, William Cuskin is professor and chair of the Department of English here at CU. He has taught comics since 2004, including one for the first comic MOOCs. And I know about that because we both have done similar things, which included almost 80,000 students. I got that right? 80,000? Wow. 80,000 students who took that course. It's amazing. He is currently working on a textbook for American comics and graphic novels. Thank you for being with us. Injured for the last half year, but he's going to soldier through.
Thank you very much, Tom. Well, thanks to everyone for showing up. I didn't expect such a big audience. I'm intimidated. I prepared a joke about, I've just heard that the Texas Rangers have won the World Series, and I'm going to tell you about other Texas Rangers, so I'm done with the joke. And so this short presentation is we'll not deal with Texas in comics, because Texas in comics would be a huge encyclopedic endeavor, and a corpus of several thousand comic books, only if you of course, if you consider comic books, if you don't consider newspaper comic strips, if you had newspaper comic strips, it gets even bigger. No, this will be rather about comics in Texas at a certain time, at a very during a very definite cultural period in the history of the United States, during the so-called counterculture era. And so the title of this, again, this short presentation, which well, it's not that it's going to be ad-libbed, but, well, I wouldn't have tons of notes that I won't read, which is good for you. I'll just, speak using my slides. That will be much better for you and for me. And so the title of the talk is Texas, the other hotbed of underground comics. So to start, I just want to remind you of two notions, establish two definitions. I assume some of you will be very familiar with the stuff I'm going to talk about. Perhaps others among the younger generation not so much. But well, I think it's important to establish foundation for what I will be talking about and the period that I will be interested in. Well, in fact, I should have reversed the order of the two definitions. The first one is the 60s. So when I talk about the 60s, well, it won't be a surprise, it won't be the decade stricto sensu, it will be from 1960 to 1969, but I'll use the term as in the way historians use chrononyms. So chrononym, it's not a disease, it's a word that designates a historical period through the interplay of its social, political, and cultural specificities. And what's interesting about chrononyms is that very often they have blurry, imprecise chronological boundaries. So among the very famous chrononyms that are used in American history, there's the Gilded Age. And you can have 20 different people, and they'll give you 20 different chronological boundaries for the Gilded Age. So the Jazz Age, which loosely refers to the 1920s, and then so the 60s. But then before the 60s, you have the 50s. And if you start playing the game of when did the 50s begin and end, well, it's not 1950, 1959, for instance. Many people will have the 50s start in 1947 with the beginning of the Cold War, and have the 50s finish in 1963 with the end of the Kennedy presidency. And for the thing being that in the end, the 50s as boundaries overlaps with the 60s in terms of chronological boundaries. The 60s begin in the late 50s and finish sometime in the first half of the 1970s. Now, so that's for the really the rough framing of the chronology that I will be working inside. And then there's the second notion, which is, well, UG Comics, as we say, for those of us who are in the know, underground comics with an X at the end. Well, I define UG Comics, underground comics, as a spectrum of creative agencies related more or less directly to cartooning, illustration, and comics per se, in the broad galaxy, literally, and chronological period of the counterculture. So for me, my idea of underground comics is really extends beyond the material that was printed strictly in comic strip form, in booklets that looked like mainstream comic books, well, at least as to the extent that they were stapled floppy pamphlets. So it's on the basis of these two notions, the 60s and underground comics, that I want to that I suggest a sort of, not rereading, but at least an expansion of our general understanding of underground comics as a cultural phenomenon. So generally, usually, traditionally, underground comics as a cultural phenomenon have been remembered as centered in the San Francisco Bay Area. There is a traditional narrative of underground comics which placed the phenomenon primarily in and around San Francisco, and in chronological terms, with an apogee, really a heyday, from 1968 to 1973, and a subsequent decline into the second half of the 1970s. So it is not an inaccurate narrative, but it's a big picture narrative. It leaves out peripheral elements in a cultural process that, when you look at it up close, this cultural process was multipolar, multilateral in the first place. And, it's not really been a mystery to anyone, for the people who have looked a little bit into the history of underground comics, that the phenomenon emerged primarily in three big urban areas, San Francisco, but also New York and Austin, Texas. We're getting there. In several, what I call regional spots, although the people who live there might disagree with this categorization, places like Philadelphia, Chicago, Cleveland, and there were big centers of countercultural production of comics in Canada, and we don't want to forget them because the interconnections at that time were many and fairly constant, with Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. Still, there is a traditional emphasis on San Francisco. When you look at the history of underground comics, and this emphasis, in retrospect, with hindsight, is fairly easy to understand. It was simply because of the Bay Area's trailblazing role in the mid-decade, so youth movement. So we all remember that the UC Berkeley free speech movement began in Berkeley in the fall of 1964. But in the domain of non-mainstream comics, those that we eventually call underground comics, from a purely chronological perspective, a lot had happened in New York in the mid-1960s, and even earlier in Texas, as far back as the late 1950s. So the point that I'm going to develop a little bit here is that Texas was arguably the other original hotbed of UG comics. Chronologically, underground comics developed in Texas to a really substantial extent, sometime before they became a mainstay of San Francisco culture. Here, again, the next point that I want to underline, and it is underlined, as a matter of fact, is that we have to make a distinction between underground comics as artifacts, and so these are artifacts. You can hold them in your hands, you can read them. So those are underground comics. And underground comics as a cultural phenomenon, which is something that you cannot hold in your hands, but that you can, reconstruct, try to analyze, try to understand several decades later. Unlike mainstream comics, and that's really the point that is often addressed very, very quickly when talking about underground comics. Underground comics were initially related to two specific cultural spheres, college magazines and music posters. And it just so happens that in Texas, and specifically in Austin, because here it was another university that played a key role. It was the University of Texas in Austin. The synergy between college mags, comics, and music posters was remarkably strong during the 1960s decade. So, what I'm doing here is I just suggest, in very broad terms, research topics on underground comics in Texas that could be of interest to young, future, and even established scholars. Why not? So, first, here you have the list of all 4 areas which I think are worthy of further academic scrutiny and scholarly scrutiny, because so far the job that's been done so far has been, well, introductory, but there's a lot of work to do, I think. First, in the consideration of graphics satire at and around the University of Texas at Austin at the turn of the 1960s. Then the graphic design of the Austin rock music scene from 1967 to the late 1970s with 2 establishments, the Vulcan Gas Company and the Armadillo World Headquarters. Then 3, making comics in Austin with the countercultural magazine The Rag and the local comic small press. And finally, but that's the topic that already has been most looked into, even though there's still some work to do, the so-called Texas Mafia in California, that is the Texans that founded Rip-Off Press, and the 2 most famous of whom are Gilbert Shelton and the late Jack Jackson. And as we go along these 4 rubrics, we'll see that one person connects all 4 topics, the famous Texan turned Parisian cartoonist, Gilbert Shelton. So, graphic satire at and around the University of Texas at Austin at the turn of the 1960s. So here I could start another talk about this magazine. The Texas Ranger, the Texas student magazine of UT Austin. It had been handled by undergraduates since actually long before the Second World War, but in the years after the Second World War, they developed a new culture of, rebellion, irreverence, among the students that were in charge of the Texas Ranger. And for instance, in 1947, the students editing the magazine got into serious trouble because they ran an article, 1947, How to Cheat. How to cheat, in the college magazine, and obviously it did not go over very well with their university's authorities at the time. So anyway, the Texas Ranger was this slightly irreverent magazine by the 50s. And at the end of the 50s, one student in charge of became the editor in 1958, 1959, Frank Stack. So Frank Stack is the man who, thanks to Wayne, I can show you a sample of his work. So where it is going? Yeah, here. Fulbert Sturgeon, Jesus Meets the Armed Forces. That's the kind of material that Frank Stack started creating in the late 50s. It was very, very irreverent at the time, and so he was an art major, and so went on to become a professor of art at the University of Missouri. So Frank Stack really initiated a new a new phase of in which he tried to introduce, and he did introduce, satire, humor, irreverence in the pages of the magazines, and attracted some interesting new young cartoonists. One in particular, Gilbert Shelton. So here this is early Gilbert Shelton art, back when he was very much influenced by the American cartoonist Virgil Parch, often signed VIP. So Shelton became the editor of the Texas Ranger in 1962-1963, and he went even further than Stack, before him, than Frank Stack, in the creation of a magazine that was, propagating the things values that were not yet called countercultural, but that were really foundational of what the new spirit of the American youth and the youth movement would be, in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of the press as well. And so you probably do not, I'm not sure I don't recognize her here, but this is a very, very famous alumna of UT Austin. It's Janis Joplin. Janis Joplin spent, a year, or even, I'm not sure she spent more than a year there, and she left Texas for California, and for a career of celebrity that was cut short, as we all know. So the Texas Ranger was the magazine produced in the university, but around the University of Texas, there were other publications. So there was this off-campus magazine, Bacchanal. You see here, it didn't have very many issues. It was created in 1962. I think it didn't have more than 3 or 4 issues. And another very interesting magazine that has not been studied, or that is, because it's so difficult to find copies of it, is the Austin Iconoclastic Newsletter. It was a magazine, so with lots of cartoons, lots of illustrations, lots of humor, founded and edited by Gilbert Shelton in 1964. And here you get the full collection. So it had 5 issues, each one in a different format. And so it's, guys, there is a wonderful dissertation. There are several wonderful dissertations to be written about, Bacchanal, the Austin Iconoclastic Newsletters, all that production of humorous, centered on humorous cartooning around the University of Texas at Austin in the early 60s. Related to it, it's the graphic design of the Austin rock music scene from 1967 to the late 70s. Austin had 2 big musical theaters in the 60s. The first one, which existed for 3 years, from 1967 to 70, was the Vulcan Gas Company. And here, over there, you see only some of the 5,836 posters, 2 postcards that were produced in 3 years for the shows that were given at the Vulcan Gas Company. And Gilbert Shelton drew many of them. And there was another cartoonist that I'll talk about in a minute, Jim Franklin, who also did a lot of design for those shows back in the time when the making of music posters was a sort of a big business. Right? It was big business in the context of the countercultural economy, of which the most famous businesses in the countercultural economy were head shops. There are not many head shops left, as far as I know. I asked Tom, and he couldn't show me any head shop around campus. I was extremely disappointed. So here's an example of one of the very, very beautiful posters drawn by Gilbert Shelton in 1967 for the Vulcan Gas Company. So the funny thing that Shelton keeps reminding people of whenever he talks about them is that as it was Texas, the posters made for the Vulcan Gas Company larger than the posters made in San Francisco. So actually, because it was Texas. Then there was, so Vulcan Gas Company closed in 1970, and another theater opened, the Armadillo World Headquarters, which was in business for 10 years. And the man, the cartoonist most associated to the Armadillo World Headquarters was Jim Franklin. So I'll show you more Jim Franklin in a minute. So on the left, you see a poster for a Freddie King concert from 1972 by Jim Franklin with one of his trademark armadillos, which we'll see again and again. And another example here, Michael Murphy concert, and the cartoonist here, the illustrator, was Michael Priest. And here again, pretty big posters. So, another important element in the Austin underground comic scene was the rag. The rag was the countercultural weekly that appeared in Austin at that time. So so here you have an example, a copy, the copy, the issue dated May 8, 1967. There, artwork by Peter Plagans, so he was one of the local cartoonists. So here again, Gilbert Shelton, who has lots of anecdotes to tell, said that he was contacted by the people in charge of the rag, and he said, "Would you like to work for us?" And he looked at the magazine and said, "Okay, guys, I'll be very happy to work for you, but what you publish is so boring. Will you agree to let me do funny comics for you?" And they said, "Okay." And that was how we created the Freak Brothers. They were appearance here, but it was so successful. Shelton's contribution to the rag was so successful that he had actually his own page, Shelton Comics, in the rag. And here again, even though much of the material that appeared in the rag as was later reprinted in Freak Brothers collections, there is still there's, to the best of my knowledge, there has never been a methodical study of the cartooning and the comics published in the rag at the end of the 60s. And then there was Austin had two genius comic artists, Shelton and the other one, the one who stayed in Texas. Shelton left for California, but the other one who left was Jim Franklin. So Jim Franklin, I showed you his poster for the Freddie King concert earlier. As early as 1969, developed a sort of graphic and visual obsession with armadillos. And literally. So this is the front cover of his first underground comics, Dillo Tunes, 1969. And here you have the inside front cover and page 1 of Dillo Tunes. So you see with almost surrealistic drawing of armadillos being squeezed out of a toothpaste tube. So in 1971, he published another comic book, Armadillo Comics. I think you brought copy of Armadillo Comics 2. And so here it is. It's super. It's brilliant. It's completely meaningless. It's senseless, but visually, graphically, it's extraordinary. And then Jim Franklin for a while moved to the Netherlands, and the third issue was titled Gordel Dier. And Gordel Dier, as you all know, is the Dutch translation of the word armadillo. So that's Gordel Dier 3. Let's see, and Gordel Dier, question mark, armadillos. And so that was, here again, Jim Franklin, someone whose work has been completely under-documented, and so there are tons of, there are the 3 Armadillo comic books, but actually Jim Franklin's art was all over the place in various magazines. There were even, so those are among the 2 most hard to find underground comics. If you're a collector of underground comics, I don't know, I've never seen copies of these 2 comics, Gas Comics 1 and Gas Comics 2, published in early in 1970. They are tremendously rare, and they cost an arm and a leg if you manage to run into a copy. And the few people that have had them in their hands and have talked about them, because you can't even find them scanned on the internet. So yeah, that tells you a lot about their how hard they are to find. So Jim Franklin, that's someone that, again, as far as I know, has never been studied methodically and to more than superficially in reference to occasional illustrations here and there. Now the third element, so that I was wanting, I meant to tell you about. Excuse me. Yeah, was what I call the Comic Small Press. So Gas Comics, published by Vulcan Gas Company in 1970. This ostentatious, really nice collection of psychedelic art put together by a collective of Austin artists. Actually, they visited the Ripoff Press people in San Francisco, who told them, look, it was Jack Jackson who told them, look, what you do is really good, but you should publish it yourself. That would probably be better for you than if we published it in your name. And so, that was there was only one issue, Ostentatious, published in 1973. But here I'll only show you the cover, but the inside, the inside art is also extremely interesting, and by cartoonists that, for many of them, didn't have much of a career in an ulterior career in cartooning. Final element, this comic Austin Stone, which had 2 issues, one in 75, the other in 1976, again with very interesting underground material in it. Those were very short-lived publishing experiences, but many of the people who participated in those comics are still alive, and it is very important to get in touch with those people, interview them, ask them about what they remember about their work at the time, before all this gets lost, and it will be too late when all that's left is just the few printed pages that have reached us. And then, so the fourth topic, the one that is already been documented, but which, believe me, warrants even more documenting. So the Texas Mafia, with the 4 original architects of Rip-Off Press. So, well, the story is that those 4 Texans, so Fred Todd, Gilbert Shelton, Jack Jackson, moved to San Francisco in 1969, following when they saw the emerging success of Zap Comics and the first underground comic book titles, and they decided that, well, at first their original intent was to print music posters, but they realized very quickly that you had to be a competent printer, and printing was something that required very specific skills. So they weren't too good to print music posters, and very soon they started printing comic books. And obviously with someone like Gilbert Shelton, who was already quite well known and had lots of connections in the new emerging underground comic scene, the Rip-Off Press became one of the important San Francisco publishers of underground comics. But still, so Fred Todd is still alive, but he's quite old now. So Gilbert Shelton is, he lives in Paris, he's very well. I saw him a few months ago, and he doesn't look like this anymore. He looks quite older, but unfortunately, Jack Jackson, instead, Dave Moriarty is still alive. So, of course, Shelton is kind of like Crumb, in the same way as Robert Crumb is the tree that hides the forest of underground comics. Gilbert Shelton is the other tree that hides the forest of Texas underground comics. But you all know his most famous characters, the Freak Brothers, and this is a page in which Phineas Freaks goes back home to his parents in Houston, Texas, and well, this is the first page, but his first contact, the first time he reaches out to his father after a long while, is not very positive. And I'll let you discover the rest of the story. So there is finally one person that has been really one fundamental influence. So chronologically, slightly later than the underground period, it's Jack Jackson. So Jack Jackson specialized in the making of historical comics, focusing on the history of Texas. And but the thing about him, and this ad is actually deceptive, is that here you have all the stereotypes, the usual stereotypes of Western comics. You know, you have Zorro, you have the Lone Ranger, you have Tonto. I mean, those are stereotyped Western, Western film and then Western comics characters. But Jackson went on to create graphic novels that were historically accurate, historically documented, and he wrote a number of stories about the historical origins of Texas, but also about memories that have been, well, sort of hidden or more or less deliberately forgotten, about massacres of native populations. So every single of those historical graphic novels by Jackson are really masterpieces of historical comic strip art. So, to conclude, although the history of underground comics in the US has become increasingly documented, its Texas-focused segment has been addressed only in a handful of articles, books, and interviews. There's a lot of work that remains to be done. And so, notwithstanding the towering personalities, Shelton and Jackson, Underground comics in Texas during the long 60s, so from the late 50s to the early 70s, in fact, appears as a sprawling creative environment in which the satirical mindset of college-age baby boomers interacted with inventive psychedelic graphic design and new progressive politics. So anyone with an interest in cultural history, in comics history in the 60s, has their work cut out for them. I mean, there are tons of primary sources that are waiting for you, primarily at UT Austin, but in many other places. And all those primary sources have a lot to tell us about the effervescence of youth culture in Texas 6 decades ago, including in hitherto ignored areas pertaining to race, class, gender, and minorities. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, President Garvey. It was fascinating. I'm sure there's a lot of comments here. I'd be remiss not to introduce Stephen Graham Jones, come in, Professor of Distinction, and Eva Riley Baldwin, endowed chair in the Department of English. So we're talking about just as comics only, the ongoing IDW series Earth Divers, and he's also written the indie graphic novels My Hero and Memorial Live. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you for that. So I wanted to open it up to our panel, if there are any comments, and we can certainly open it up to the audience as well. So any questions or?
You know, I would say those anthropomorphized armadillos, they survived into the 80s in Texas in the form of Lone Star beer commercials. You remember those? There was a giant armadillo that would tear into delivery trucks of beer and drink out the beer.
So what was the name of the brand?
Lone Star?
Lone Star?
Yeah. But I wonder, you say that there was the alternative, or a different rock scene going on in Austin. It was also the breeding ground for outlaw country. You know, Willie and Waylon were at that Armadillo factory or whatever the headquarters, and I wonder, like, how to say this. I wrote on my hand, but I can't read it now.
You want a hand?
You mentioned progressive politics and counterculture, and that's definitely, I mean, the outlaw country scene was definitely counterculture. You know, and I'm sure some of those posters included Willie and Waylon. I wonder if there is a similar ethos in outlaw country and this underground comic scene, basically. It seems like there would be. It would make sense to me.
Well, I must confess my ignorance. Outlaw country?
Yeah, it was outlaw. It was country that was pushing back against the Nashville scene.
Country music?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, they left Nashville and they came to Austin and they cooked up this whole new scene. In 1975, is that when the album Outlaws came out? I think it's 1975. Yeah. But it seems like it's a similar, like it's like a petri dish.
Well, it's a kind of music that I know nothing about, so honestly, I have no answer. Sorry, but you know, I know a bit about comics, very, very little about Texas, and nothing about outlaw country.
Oh, another question, if I can do 3 here. You know, in California, there was a Tijuana Bibles happening. Was there something like that in Texas in the 50s? I don't have any idea.
Well, Tijuana Bibles were found. Children, get out of the room. Yeah, so for the people who don't know what we're talking about, Tijuana Bibles were 8-page booklets, you know, about this big, which contained comics that lampooned very, very famous comic strip characters or film stars or political figures, and they were pornographic stories, very, very pornographic. And so Tijuana Bibles were produced in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And actually, they were called Tijuana Bibles, but it was completely, well, as far as I know, they were never produced in or near Tijuana. Actually, they were mostly produced in the East, New York and Chicago because they came from organized crime money. That was one of the segments, one of the businesses that organized crime, in which organized crime invested its money. And so a lot of Tijuana Bibles were printed in Chicago, in New York, in Boston. And whenever there were FBI crackdowns on shipments on Tijuana Bibles, they were generally in the East. And so they were, a number of historians of American comics like to consider Tijuana Bibles as precursors of underground comics. Well, they were to the extent that they were definitely precursors to porn, to the pornographic production that actually began only at the end of the 60s. Again, that's one of the misconceptions in the history of underground comics, is that they were pornographic from the start. No, they were not. Underground comics became pornographic in 1969, when basically Crumb and his friends, following the influence of one of them, who was S. Clay Wilson, came up with the notion that, everything they had in their heads was fair game for visual representation, no matter how ugly or obscene or socially unacceptable it could be. And so, that was when underground comics really became pornographic. So, but before that, there was hardly any pornography in underground comics. And but then Tijuana Bibles had been around since the 1920s, and they were they were not that easy to get hold of, because you had to basically run into big guys with big coats outside of schools, and going, hey kid, I'd like to see a comic, a funny book, or they were for sale in some bars, in some with some sleazy stores, and they were never ever produced in or near Tijuana. And so the Tijuana Bibles is one of their names, but they were also named 8-pagers, and there are other names, but that I cannot pronounce in public here.
So. Go ahead.
Well, the association is Tijuana was known for its brothel industry.
Yeah, exactly. But,
so kind of backing off Stephen. So this was really enjoyable, and I think in it you've couched it as like possible research topics, but I think the emphasis here is in a rethinking and redefinition of underground comics. Crumb has stood, as you say, as this enormous tree. But Crumb has his own baggage now that, in fact, makes it somewhat hard to enjoy, I think. So part of what you're giving us is that there's many ways into underground comics, and Austin is an important one. So I guess, this is where I would connect with Stephen, is like, if we begin to redefine underground comics, what is its ideology? If it's not married to this, anything in my head can go on the paper, to shock you, to open you up. Is it still the same kind of progressiveness? Because Outlaw Country isn't an East Coast progressive movement. It's got a very different feeling. So I guess, what is your sense of a redefined underground comics? What is its possibility? What is the direction? How does it alter our narrative about what underground comics was capable of doing?
Well, the thing is, it's not like, it's just to remember connections that many of us have been aware of for a long time, but that have been, I like to think they've been underemphasized. The generation of artists, cartoonists that became the underground artists, they were all baby boomers who read Mad Magazine in the early 50s, and they were heavily influenced by the humor of Harvey Kurtzman. And so what was at the heart of Kurtzman's humor? Irreverence, the idea that individuals should not agree to be fooled by the media, by the government, by the entertainment industry, that they should think for themselves. And again, the ideology of early underground comics was the refusal of the mainstream culture of the Eisenhower period, the refusal of Perry Como songs, of the kind of daily life depicted in the show with the redhead.
Lucy.
Yeah, I Love Lucy. That sort of thing. And so that's really, I think, the heart of their ideology. And of course, at some point, Crumb went overboard in that Comix 4 with the story titled Joe Blow, in which he let loose on the criticism of this 1950s type conformity, and described a family, a typical white bread American family, which actually turned out to be completely incestuous, with the mother having sex with the son and the father with the daughter. And obviously at that time it didn't go over very well with many people. But that was just the most extreme incarnation of what I think was definitely a positive and progressive ideology that had been born with Kurtzman in Mad magazine. Well, in Mad comic book, the Mad comic book.
May I ask almost the opposite question? Which I think it's fascinating to see the way that these comics depict the West as its own kind of region, and as much as they speak to an underground culture that exists outside of Texas, they look still very different from things like gay comics and things that come out of San Francisco. So is there a worth, or is it important even to kind of preserve the regionality in reading these comics, to see them as something distinct to Texas or distinct to the West?
Well, that's a very good question. I would say that seen from France, all that is American stuff. But I think it's the point you're making is particularly relevant to the music posters. I'm pretty sure that the design, the themes, the topics, the imagery in the Austin music posters was definitely different and distinct from what was done simultaneously in San Francisco, and not simply because of the size of the posters, as Charlton jokes. If I can, hold on. Yeah, here there's a reference here to a book which is what is it? Alan Schaefer. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with this book, edited by Alan Schaefer in 2015, Homegrown, Austin Music Posters, 1967 to 1982. So it was a book published, it was based on an exhibit that was organized at the university, at UT Austin, I think. And the book is just, it's brilliant. When you browse it and you see all that artwork and and then the obsessive recurrence of armadillos in particular, but that was Jim Franklin's thing, and he literally contaminated many of the cartoonists of the period. And I read recently that armadillos, in fact, are not even particularly typical of Texas. It was just an idea that was kind of constructed artificially in the middle of the 20th century.
But on the historical side, so I grew up kind of doing a lot of mainstream superheroes. I'm no surprise there. And I broke in doing what we called ground level comics, which was post underground, but minus the drugs, minus the sex, but genre splayed. I think I bought my first underground at your shop, you bad, terrible man, as opposed to a head shop. But the distinction for me was that we called those drug comics. Like they were things that you either had to be high to understand, or because you were high, you didn't care if you understood them, or if you read them not high, you thought you were high because what the hell is happening? Except Jackson, which I got to much later. I was like, well, that's drug comics, I don't need more of that. But Jackson is not that at all. And that the Austin and the Texasism of that is really interesting. The idea that Shelton and Jackson are part of the same circle, but one goes super historical and one goes the San Francisco direction. I don't know what my question is, but that's really interesting to me. What did you make of that in your travels?
Well, Shelton and Stack, basically, I mean, what they share originally was, Shelton's first style, as I showed you, it's not the style that made him world famous. It was when he drew, so that's the second style, so the Freak Brothers style, so the one that made him famous in San Francisco, thanks to the material reprinted by Rip-Off Press, and he went on to produce Freak Brothers comics until 20 years ago, and now, and even after settling in France, he started creating a new series, Not Quite Dead, with a French cartoonist, Pic, which, they were featured a band of, rather mediocre musicians, which it was a sort of, second big series after the Freak Brothers, but you could tell that the spirit of the 1960s was no longer there. So anyway, Shelton's first style was let me see if I can I enlarge?
Yes.
Magnify? Yeah. There. Okay, so that's Shelton's early style, heavily influenced by Virgil Parch, Vip. So line work that was very simple, superficially, extremely, the kind of the cartoony style that you found in. For instance, a sort of simplified New Yorker cartoon style, and Stack's initial style was very much like that. So they really had this common interest for this, this sort of visual graphic humor from the New Yorker school, and but then afterwards, their paths. Sorry, we're talking of Stack.
They were cartoony / then went drug direction, but the historical, like it's heavy historical stuff, like you were saying.
Yeah.
Very
subject. So Stack and Shelton, they shared that. This original, stylistic, common stylistic source. For Jackson. Jackson was he was someone who was in search of himself for a long time, basically, and he really because all his great historical graphic novels were produced. He didn't start producing them until the second half of the 1970s, and went on to produce them. Until the end of his life, until the very early 21st century. So, Jackson, was not really someone who was very much into humor like Shelton. Shelton has always been interested only in humor, and he's said it repeatedly. He said it to me, but to many other people. So when I was working on the book that I've edited and that will come out in a couple of months. So humor has always been Shelton's creative horizon, and you don't, I mean, even if you look very hard, well, there's one story that is not humorous in the entire production of Shelton. It's a story about a Parisian cemetery, the Cimetière du Père-Lachaise, where you find, for instance, the grave of Jim Morrison. So it's one non-humorous comic. For the rest, it's always been humorous, satirical. It's the only thing he's ever liked to do. But Jackson had for one thing, Jackson got a degree in accounting, which but without much enthusiasm for his career. And then, he left for San Francisco and worked for the Family Dog company, and he was both their accountant and their art director, which was an interesting double function, come to think of it. And but really it took him very, very long to find his true path. And honestly, right now I can think of significant where there. I mean, if Shelton and Jackson had very had so much proximity in the first place, simply because they both hailed from Texas.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's almost a symbiotic, maybe parasitic relationship between underground comics and concert venues. So you have the Fillmore East, and you have the magazines that support the East, like the Critic, with cartoons by Pfeiffer, stories by Gene Shepard, a very much more urban experience, not a Austin experience. And you have the West, the Fillmore West, and the psychedelic experience, and you have the Armadillo, which is doing it. Would it be safe to say that when those venues closed down, the lifeblood went out of underground comics as well?
Well, the lifeblood of underground comics had gone for a long time. The underground comics, technically, they were dead by 1976. The last significant magazine was Arcade, the Comics Review, which came out in '75 and folded in '76. And after that, Art Spiegelman swore that he would never ever be involved in comics again, and we saw what happened afterwards. But by the end of the '70s, the thing is, I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable about the history of music venues to give you a more substantial answer. But really, the original artistic impulse of graphic design and graphic satire that underlay underground comics, in fact, largely vanished by the middle of the '70s because it had lost most of its original impetuses, which were the Vietnam War and the rebellion of the American youth. And the problem being that by the middle of the 1970s, the rebellion had become sort of almost mainstream lifestyle for many people. There were many people who were not, that rebellious, but smoked recreational drugs, listened to psychedelic music, wore flashy clothes and so on. So and then I don't know enough about the history of music venues to connect the end of underground comics with the end of those those archetypal music venues.
You know, I've always thought, I mean, somebody told me or I read somewhere that underground comics got a really harsh blow when the government cracked down on head shops in like 73 or so, right? And so the retail point went away for selling them, so they couldn't make money anymore. Okay.
It's true, yeah. You probably know about this.
At the end of censorship.
It's the Supreme Court in 1973 handed down two rulings about obscenity. That basically they used to have this test to define obscenity. So I forget the parameters, but then in June 1973, that was in a couple of decisions about theaters that showed pornographic movies. And basically the Supreme Court said, look, we leave to communities the responsibility of defining what they find obscene and what they call obscenity. And that was not good, obviously, for the economic base of the underground comics industry, because, well, as you said, a number of head shops suddenly stopped carrying underground comics because they didn't want to, any police raids or anything, and especially if they were located too close to schools. I mean, they were often located very close to universities, but they were not supposed to be located too close to schools, as far as I know. And so the decline definitely began in 1973, but it was compounded, in fact, by a crisis in the paper industry. The cost of paper skyrocketed because of some issues in the Canadian forests and in the Canadian timber industry. All those elements really combined and led to the almost definitive collapse of the first underground. But by that time, there had been a mutation into forms such as ground level comics, which used some of the forms of underground comics, but without or with much less drugs, without or with much less sex, and so that was the beginning of what became the graphic evolution and the artistic evolution that led to the really interesting development of mainstream comic books in the 1980s, with Frank Miller, with Howard Chaykin, with Bill Sienkiewicz, and so on.
And they get a lot of credit for things like doing historical stuff, but Jack Jackson is unknown, and it should be inverted.
Yeah, and again, Jack Jackson, very. So let me go back to manageable. Yeah. So where is? Oh, hold on. Yeah. There is a very interesting book, which is, even though it's a bit old now, but it's still totally useful. It's by Joseph Wittek, which was one of the very first books written by an American academic about comic books. It was it was the volume that inaugurated the specialization of University Press in Mississippi in comic studies in 1989. Joseph Wittek, Comic Books as History, The Narrative Art of Jack Jackson, Art Spiegelman, and Harvey Pekar. And as early as 1989, Joseph Wittek wrote really insightful analyses of Jackson's first historical graphic novels. And but then, as far as I know, there has not been any other book, academic book, devoted to Jackson since that time, and there's a wealth of things to study in the production of Jack Jackson.
Yep.
We also, though, shouldn't lose this comic, concert poster connection, because a lot of those people, that's how they were making more money, right, by doing that. And the Ransom Center at Austin, which is where I think that 2015 book largely drew from, they have an ephemeral library, which is a collection mostly of those concert posters. What happens is when somebody starts studying a trend, they start picking up all the ephemera from that person. So I imagine, I didn't even think to look the whole time I was there, that there's probably some comics caught up in that ephemeral collection because of that, just because all of that, but all of that is so blended together when you're looking at it through that style lens. The other thing about Austin and material study, and this is half humorous but half serious, is that any of the classic coffee shops or restaurants like Kirby Lane and Spider House and all of those, if you ever wind up in the bathroom, not that I've spent a lot of time in there, but they're wallpapered in comics, and that's been a thing that's been going on for a lot of years. So if you start tearing down, like it's, there's 80s X-Men.
What are you doing in the bathroom?
Just saying.
Research.
I'm just saying. There's a research project to be find about how those were displayed, sometimes economically to wallpaper a bathroom, but sometimes that's how that content
That's the
was
archaeological
distributed.
dive.
Right, and that's how it's distributed in red, and you're trying to get a message out and wallpaper the bathroom with the underground comics. I'm just saying, it's probably about 4 layers deep though, so I'm saying there's a project there.
Well, there's an extra research topic. Bathroom wallpapering.
I bought my first underground comics at a head shop in the early 1970s. And once those stopped being produced and distributed in head shops, that was about the same time as comic book stores were starting to open up also. And it was an evolution, I think, for starting out in Austin and going to California. I think the one thing that changed in California and evolved more than anything was LSD. And that's what really started this whole thing of getting into your head and doing underground comics, and changed it more than anything else was LSD. I really do think that's what changed everything. And then it kept evolving, and comic shops also started carrying things like Hate and 8-Ball, and that kept evolving. And you're right that there's not really undergrounds anymore, but they're still, they were there to start what's come after it. And so they were very, very important for their time. And I collect them, I've loved them for all these years, and they're very, very important.
Yeah. No, but honestly, I'm sure there is a continuum starting with Harvey Kurtzman's Mad Comic Book in 1952, and then going all the way up to now. And of course, in the middle, there's this big segment of the underground comics period, and morphing into ground level comics, and then the second generation of underground comics with Crum's Weirdo and Spiegelman and Mouly's Raw in the 1980s, and then the Fantagraphics production with Hate, the Los Bros, Hernandez, Love and Rockets, and it's really there's a creative spectrum, a creative diversity that began, among, let's put it bluntly, among New York Jews in 1952, working for EC Comics and having this, mindset slightly different from the mainstream, white middle class society of the time, and this was the original seed that inspired so many younger people from the baby boom generation who did not really want at all to grow up like their parents in the in the post-war society of Eisenhower and so on.
There's a raft of fantasy comics now that I would say the cartoonists have no knowledge that I'm aware of underground comics, but that read like LSD trips in the modern times, like a lot of talking animals doing who knows what and trapezoidal, objects in space. And I'll find some in your shop, but they're the new undergrounds, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like Jonan Vasquez's Johnny the Homicidal Maniac seems to come out. I mean, it's in the same category, but I feel like he didn't know Crumb. It doesn't feel like he knew Crumb,
Yeah.
I do wonder if Austin's legacy, though, specifically, is more linked to the idea of censorship and the idea that, I mean, in California and in San Francisco, where you've said the underground becomes the mainstream, that, Texas doesn't necessarily have that moment, not to discredit, any kind of counterculture in Texas, but I wonder if there's a potential through line from this underground network in Texas to what we see now with book bannings and what we see, this kind of harsh counterculture that still isn't accepting of these ideologies yet because it never kind of broke through to the surface. I don't know if that's a question or if that's another potential dissertation
Texas
topic.
is weird.
Well, all I can tell you is that, during this heyday of the Texas Ranger from the 50, when Stack was in charge, that was 57 or 58. From 58 to 63, the successive editors of the Texas Ranger were constantly at odds with the authorities of UT Austin, and they got into trouble repeatedly because of their cartoons, because of their articles, because of the photographs, the photographs of students, well, generally female students, that they ran in the magazine, and there was a sort of permanent tug of war between students and the university authorities. Inside the magazine, the magazine was really the field, the locus of this tension between the youngsters trying to go farther and farther, to see how far they could get, and the authorities, holding them back. Well, the whole in loco parentis system fell apart only after 1964. Don't forget that, nowadays students on campus do whatever they like, and we don't want to know what you guys do. But until 1964, the discipline on university campuses in the United States was very strict. That's what I've always been told.
Do you see with stuff like the Texas Ranger or other university papers, student-led papers, do you see a similar trajectory to underground comics?
That's one of the things that I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. And that's, again, another research topic. Look into other university magazines, other college magazines of the period, see what was going on. Well, it just so happened that at UT Austin, they had Shelton, they had, this creative effervescence that led directly to underground comics making in San Francisco. But I'm pretty sure that there were quite a few other universities out there with people who did fascinating things, but who, for some reasons, never became famous or never continued their work in cartooning careers. I don't know. I'm sure there have to be magazines and periodicals that contain gems that contain proto-underground comics that we don't know about.
I wonder if there's also another relationship that we haven't touched on, because what's also happening or burgeoning at this type are fanzines, and they're coming through. And what's the relationship between fanzines and underground comics in terms of people who don't have a voice in the mainstream coming through? And the interesting correlation between that, Friedrich Wertham, who gave us Seduction of the Innocent in 1970, wrote a monograph on fanzines where he praised the work of fanzines and so on, and said, because he liked the individual spirit that came out. Is there a relationship between production of fanzines and underground comics?
And I would just throw on conventions and coming togethers around comics.
Yeah, well, conventions, the first conventions happened around 1964, 63, 64. And so the connection with fanzines actually was pretty clear at first, because pretty much all the big names among underground cartoonists were involved in fanzines.
Right.
You know, Robert Crumb and his brother had their own fanzine, Foo, at the very end of the 50s. Jay Lynch, Spiegelman, they got their first drawings printed in this fanzine, which was called Blasé, I think. There were also. There's also the one of the important bridges is Harvey Kurtzman's magazine Help,
Right.
because Help featured Crumb, Shelton, Lynch, and John Cleese from the soon to be Monty Python member, Woody Allen.
Gloria Steinem was on staff.
Sorry?
Gloria Steinem.
Yeah, Gloria
She was
Steinem
on the staff.
was on staff.
And Jerry Lewis. Yeah, he was on the cover of a couple of helps.
So yeah, the connection with fanzines was very clear. But the thing is, as far as I know, the majority of comic-themed fanzines were concerned with superhero comics. Really, from the basically from the time Stan Lee started putting out. It's new generation. Marvel started putting out the new generation of superheroes. Most comics really were focused on superheroes, but still there were the EC fan addicts,
Right.
of course. They were there too. Actually, the connection was more between the early fans of EC Comics. Those were close to the guy that went into the underground comics later, rather than with those that did superhero-themed fanzines, like Roy Thomas and Jerry Bells and so on.
Right.
So
Yes.
you may or may not be able to answer this, but it's just a thing that has occurred to me over the course of this discussion, which is all of these underground comics are being published at all this time with all this great social upheaval and the transition between the 60s and the 70s and all this stuff going on. You would think that these would be incredibly progressive publications. There's all this stuff written about the incredibly problematic racial imagery in a lot of these comics, and the nature of this conversation even focusing on the struggle between these authors and their authority figures and all of this stuff, leaving out the fact that this was all happening in very white spaces among very white people having very white conversations. And so my question is, specifically in these, but sort of in the underground movement, sort of writ large, the alternative voices within those communities, are you finding those in any of these spaces? Have you, especially in Texas with its large Latino population, for example? I mean, there's lots of other people who are having other kinds of conversations, and I'm just wondering how much of that, if any, bled into any of this work at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is, it all boils down to the sources that we have access to. the comics that we have access to, that we know of, they were indeed produced by white people. And the stories most of the time featured white people, and they were mostly males, few females. It took a long time for underground comics to address issues related to homosexuality and what we call, LGBT issues nowadays. But again, there may be publications that we don't know of, that have not surfaced, that were really, really produced in small quantities in certain neighborhoods. Love and Rockets? Love and Rockets by the Los Bros Hernandez. Initially, it was this small print run booklet that they had printed for themselves, and they were lucky to be noticed by Gary Groth, who was launching Fantagraphics, and told them, hey guys, what you do is really interesting. Do you think you could produce enough to make it a periodical? And yeah, they had this lucky break, but I'm pretty sure that there are lots of similar stories of young creators from various minorities who produced things that we don't know about, or that are located or buried deep within regional archives or somewhere, I don't know. And honestly, I'm looking forward to seeing young scholars unearthing those books and finally discovering what those people who were on the margins had to say, what they said, what they wrote, what they drew, what they produced. So,
to piggyback on that, it would be interesting to know if there were people from Texas writing in Spanish but being publishing comics, say Mexico, which has a strong comics tradition and publishing.
Yeah, I'm sure. Honestly, I can't imagine for a minute that there were not people publishing Spanish language comics in Texas at that time.
Right, so it gets back to questions of archives.
They have to be somewhere.
Right. Comes back to the issue of artifact and culture, right? The conversation on music, I think, opened up, right from the start. How do we read culture? How do we understand it? And this powerful connection you're making between comic artifacts and poster artifacts, and then connecting that to specific places. Jim's comment about different concert halls. It's really interesting to reconsider underground comics as not simply the bailiwick of Haight-Ashbury and, a luminary genius of Crumb overshadowing, but to begin to open up. In a way, we've moved the branches of your tree enough to imagine these authors and creators that maybe we don't even know, but now we can begin to imagine them within this DIY rubric of comics.
Yeah, I think I find it really interesting that at the same time you have these underground comics making all of this sort of progressive commentary, they're also full of really problematic racial imagery. And sort of and gender imagery as well, right? So it's like how progressive these.
But then that San Francisco then sprouts the autobiographical truth of those people going, no, screw that, this is my life, I'm going to portray it in this modality. So it does lead to something in some way.
Yeah, and then again, we're lucky at the University of Bordeaux-Montaigne. At the end of this month, we're going to award and to give an award to Trina Robbins, to give her an honorary doctorate for her work and career as trailblazer in the making of women's comics, feminist comics, and her scholarship about the history of women in U.S. comics, as comics makers. She studied female comics makers, readers, female characters, and yes, it took a long time for the historiography to open up simply to the dimension of women in comics, but it did. And so Trina Robbins opened the way in the 80s and 90s, and there are more people, there are more and more people following her, and this happens in various domains. And the thing is, well, it's you can't. Well, how could I put it? Yeah, it's a shame that underground comics were not progressive in the way that we frame progressivism nowadays, but they were just a product of their times, right? And so they were, well, they had, they promoted a certain vision of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And well, it took a few more decades and a couple of more generations for notions of, you know, individual freedoms, freedom of speech and expression, but more than that, to become elements that form our present-day notion of progressivism, with you know, with emphasis on, of course, on freedom of speech, but also on you know, the women's rights, condition of women, LGBT rights, minority rights, and so on.
So young people get to work. I work here. You know, we're even over time. I'd like to thank our panel and Professor Gavier. Thank you so much.